Hi all, welcome back to Environmental Science 101, and we're going to continue talking about ecology, and a big portion of ecology is tracking populations. And what is a population doing? So we already talked about the range of a population, some other dynamics that we're going to talk about is whether or not the population is growing or has the capacity to grow. Um, and sometimes that capacity to grow is based on the resources in the region. Maybe they're already at carrying capacity, which we'll come back to and kind of talk about that. Okay, so diving in to population growth is normally it's modeled in a way that we're trying to predict what's going to happen in the future, or we're trying to look at the characteristics that might limit a population's ability to grow. So like I said before, do they have the capacity in their current situation to grow? Or is the population at maximum capacity? Or is the population over their maximum capacity, which means that pretty soon that population, if they've overshot how much resources they have, or from a food perspective or nesting sites or whatnot, pretty soon what's going to happen is that population will start to decline back under the carrying capacity. And we'll come back and we'll talk about carrying capacity as we go. Okay, so first off, we need to talk about what's called the biotic potential or biological potential of an organism or of a population, of a species. Right? Normally we symbolize it by an italicized R. Okay, sometimes it's an italicized R with an I, which indicates intrinsic rate of growth. And we'll come back and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But really, R is just a symbol to show how fast a population can grow if there's no limits. So this would just be based on the ability of that species. How many offspring does the species produce? How long do those offspring wait before maturation? And then, like, really, what's the amount, the maximum at which that population can grow? That's symbolized by R, the biotic potential of that species. And by far, when we use just straight R, it is the most simplistic model, best case scenario model, and then we're normally working with that as kind of the baseline. This is best case scenario, and then we might change things because we might look at, well, what's the birth rate actually in the environment? What's the death rate in the environment? What's the immigration in the environment or immigration? What's the carrying capacity? How much food resources do they have? And all these things can go into what the actual growth rate is, not the maximal rate. Okay? When we're using the maximum rate, right, we have a growth rate that looks like this. Growth rate, or G, is equal to the intrinsic rate of growth times the N, big N, which is the population size. So big N is the population size. Growth we're often after, so this is the change in the number of organisms over a period of time. Right? So this might be, we might be interested in the growth rate of population in years. Okay? We might be interested in the growth rate of population in a month. We might be interested if we're talking about something like bacteria or protozoans, but even we might be interested in the growth rate of a population in a week or a day, and that would kind of give us an idea of how fast that population can change over a given amount of time. Okay. So when we use G equals intrinsic rate of growth times N, we call that an exponential growth model. Okay? An exponential growth model will have a J-shaped curve. So it'll start off fairly slow and then just keep rising indefinitely. if that was possible. It's not possible. You can have populations that are growing exponentially, but eventually they will move from an exponential growth curve to a logistic growth model. And we'll look at this here in a second. So when we talk about that rate of growth, we can actually define a population's rate of growth not by hypotheticals like the average number of pups a dog produces is 6, therefore and they can have a litter of pups every 2, maybe 3 times a year, so their intrinsic rate of growth for a year might be 18 pups. Okay, that is hypothetical. Okay? Instead, what we can do is we can calculate their rate of increase by looking at the birth rate of a population. We're not just talking about like the average individual, but if we can look at the birth rate of a population, so maybe we're interested in a population of wolves, and we say, okay, what's their birth rate? How many pups are they having in this population per year? Okay. What's the death rate? How many individuals are leaving via death? Okay. Those two, so birth minus death, it gives us one value. And then if the population's able to, in many cases this doesn't pertain to a lot of species, but if the population's allowing for immigration, like maybe there's another wolf population to the north that individuals could migrate in and increase the number of individuals in the population, or maybe that individuals, as this population grows, individuals are leaving. So we have immigration, people coming in, and immigration, people leaving, or in this case, wolves. Whatever it is, it doesn't really matter. Whatever organism it is, it doesn't really matter. Okay? So together, birth minus death, immigration minus immigration, you add them together, that gives you a rate of growth, a rate of change. Okay? So just keep that in mind. So there it is again. B is birth rate, D is death rate, E is immigration, okay, and I is immigration, and that will determine our R, or can determine our R. Again, sometimes E and I are not, they're not relevant. For example, we've talked quite a bit about devil's hole pupfish. They occur in a single region in the world, a single spot. There is no immigration, there's no immigration. Okay, so they're not leaving, they're not coming in, so it's just birth rate, death rate. Other populations, right? We might talk about populations of whales, or populations of seals, or population of salmon in different regions. Then immigration and immigration might play a role. You could get some individuals from different stock or different populations coming into the one that you're studying. Okay. So back to that growth rate. Again, exponential growth rate, no matter how or what is growing exponentially, it will always eventually make it to a limit. Okay? And that limit is called the carrying capacity. Okay? So the top amount at which a ecosystem can hold or can provide for is the carrying capacity. Now, what determines K? Well, in a lot of cases it's food, okay? But in other cases there might be plenty of food and it's a shortage of suitable habitat. So maybe you're a sponge and you need a hard surface to get established, and maybe where in that population there's very few boulders or very few rocky substrate, and most of it's sand, and they can't get established on the sand. So those sponges, they're limited by the number of hard surfaces in that environment. So that's what's their carrying capacity. Maybe there's plenty of food. They're filter feeders. Maybe there's plenty of food coming in, but the actual carrying capacity is the number of hard surfaces. Hey, there's lots of situations where carrying capacity is not food related, but might be something else. Right? Carrying capacity could also be potentially another organism, another living organism, in the aspect of potentially disease. So if your population reaches a certain amount, a certain density, the connection between individuals is so dense that diseases, bacterial infections, viruses, things like that can run rampant between the population or within the population, and can cause that to create a carrying capacity, a maximum number at which the environment can support. So there's lots of ways. The other thing I want to make sure you guys understand is K is not stagnant. Okay? The carrying capacity can move. Okay? It can be adjusted. As you know, if we go back to sponges and these hard surfaces for them to get established, let's say you have a big flood and it causes a landslide and pushes some more rocks into that region, and now you have more boulders. Well, your carrying capacity might have just increased. Right? Now you can establish more. What if you have a big mudslide in the region and it creates a bunch of silt and it covers a bunch of the boulders that were once there, right? Under a large layer of silt. Now it limits the number of spots that they can get established, so therefore your carrying capacity might go down. We see this often with food and interactions between species, but carrying capacity can move, it can migrate, and depending on the environmental change. So again, the J-shaped growth curve is called the exponential growth curve. A growth curve that is associated with a carrying capacity is called a logistic growth equation, or a logistic growth curve, and typically has an S shape or sigmoidal shape. Okay? The equation that we use to that's associated with the growth of a logistic growth equation or growth pattern. Still after growth, we're still using our rate of increase, okay, which is again birth minus death plus immigration versus immigration, the original population size. But now we have this other component, this carrying capacity. If we know how many organisms can be established in the given region, then that's our K. Like, how many organisms can that environment sustain? Right? Maybe it's 1,000, so your K is 1,000. Maybe it's 10 million. Okay, whatever it is, that's your K. And when you calculate this, right, the closer K is to N, the lower or slower your growth rate is going to be. When N and K are equal, growth is 0. So these are ways at which population ecologists track populations over time, which is really important for environmental scientists, because environmental scientists are often looking at, well, what's happening to organisms in this environment? How do human-induced changes potentially change population? Are human-induced changes, is it reducing the K? Are we reducing how many organisms can live in a population? Well, potentially in some situations. When we take out forests and put in cities or housing, like housing regions or new roads, new schools, when we take out that habitat on a terrestrial landscape, well, yeah, the K for the organisms that use that forested habitat, that goes down. Okay? Same thing in ocean situations and marine situations. If we're dredging and removing coral reef, or if we're bleaching coral by using toxins and by dumping sewage or toxic water into the ocean or under maybe potentially somewhat normal circumstances, the temperature in the environment is warming so much that the coral in that region can't withstand the new temperatures, and they get bleached out and they die. Okay? Well, your K goes down. Other situations, maybe we're dealing with endangered species. Maybe we're dealing with species of concern, and we decide, hey, we're going to protect this land. And in fact, we're not just going to protect this land, we're going to take this old farmland and we're going to reestablish this old farmland back into grasslands. Or we're going to take these marine habitats and make marine sanctuaries. Okay? No fish zones, no dredging zones, nothing around these marine sanctuaries. And in fact, anytime we can, we're going to expand those. So now you have these regions where potentially the K of that region is going up because the habitat is improving, which is going to allow more organisms in that population, whatever the population is, to get established. Okay? So looking at just a growth model, the two models that we typically look at, exponential growth again is that J-shaped curve. Eventually, all exponential growth models will turn into logistic growth models. Okay, so they can't increase indefinitely. Eventually, they will always reach some carrying capacity. But in some situations, when we sample that population, it might have an exponential growth model. It might fit an exponential growth model. It might be increasing. We might not know what the K is. Okay, but all species on this planet have a carrying capacity, and they will establish some kind of logistic growth model at some point in time. The other thing I want you to just be aware of is generation time. Okay, time is dependent on the species. Okay, for some species, okay, maybe if we're talking about large whales, blue whales, the baleen whales, we might be talking generation. It might be 10 years, 20 years, between generation times. Okay, so they might be 20 years between a single pregnancy. So the generation time is not in single years, but maybe in 5-year periods or something like that. Versus if we're talking about things like polyps or coral reefs, where we might be talking about marine creatures that can go through asexual reproduction within a week and maybe a month at max. Okay, well then we might be talking about the generation time is in month variables or day variables even. Okay? So keep that in mind. Normally the population size, we're just talking about individuals. Okay, so that's what the N is. Okay? So let's look at kind of an example of a fur seal example. So in the early 1800s, and even before that, there was a big trade on fur seal pelts, and the issue with a lot of marine mammals is they occur on islands, and that's not the issue. But the issue is when they breed on islands, they're breeding on in these regions where there are no predators. Okay? Maybe there's some avian predators, but majority of the time there are no predators. There are no terrestrial predators. So when man came to visit islands and establish themselves as the superior being that we often think we are, it was easy picking. Okay, the fur seals, they weren't going anywhere. Like, they've never had to run from a terrestrial predator often, and so these fur seals, you could just step off the boat and club them on the head and take them back and take the pelt, and that's exactly what happened. So we knocked the population down a lot. okay, almost to extinction on a lot of the fur seal species. And then we started realizing what we were doing, and in the early 1900s we decided, hey, we should put a ban on, fur seal hunting, because the populations are so low that it might not even be worth doing that. Might even not be worth getting their pelts anymore. And so once that goes into effect, now look at that growth curve. Okay, it starts off and it starts looking like it's going to be an exponential growth curve. Okay? It starts as that J, but then that J starts to straighten out, and it starts to become a sigmoidal growth curve, okay, or an S-shaped growth curve, which is indicative of logistic growth model. Okay, so the population starts off really fast, okay, and starts increasing, exponentially, and then boom, it's starting to reach its carrying capacity on whatever inhabit that we're actually exhibiting or taking the data on. So a certain island might reach this carrying capacity of 10,000 individuals, when the population might have started at 1,000 individuals. So there's lots of things that can go into this. That carrying capacity, again, I talked about it. It could be competition between other species that are similar. It could be competition between each other for nesting sites, or whatever it might be, birthing regions, feeding grounds, all kinds of things that can determine the carrying capacity. Change over time. Okay, so carrying capacity doesn't have to be stagnant. And the other thing is, you can see right here, the actual dots on this graph are the populations. You can see the population actually shoots above the carrying capacity. This often happens, okay? Because the species itself doesn't know how many individuals it can have in that population. What normally happens is most species overshoot. Okay? They overshoot and then they crash. And then because they crash, there's more resources. So in the next couple of years or next year, maybe they have a huge population bloom or a huge population increase. Okay? And then maybe they go a couple years, high populations, and then they crash, and then rebound, and then they crash. And that's what normally happens around a carrying capacity, is they overshoot, decrease, overshoot, decrease, overshoot, decrease. And when we draw a sigmoidal curve, it just looks like it's a straight line, like they sit on the K at all times. Okay? All right, so with that, when we come back, we'll talk about population density a little bit more, and we'll kind of put some of these things together when it comes to population dynamics next time.